Star Trek, Farewell to Arms. Chapter 3. The More Things Change. Asterios materialized aboard the Hemingway. It had been a few days since his reassignment, and he had sent his personal effects ahead, the few he still had, to be left in his new captain's quarters and ready room. He had already noticed the quality of the ship. The Armstrong had undergone a modernization refit before he and Demetrios were assigned to it. Still, the Centaur class carried some of the most recent technology available to Starfleet and the Federation, modeled on the Excelsior class, the most advanced ship of the line. It was clean, and the off-white main color with light pastel blue and black accents gave it an air of quality. The transporter room itself was also improved, with a full circular pad and a control console off to the side. Standing by it was Gorv, with the widest smile on his face. Next to him was Commander Voss, and next to her was Admiral Oridanis. She stepped forward. "Captain Ferdinand, I would like to formally welcome you aboard the USS Hemingway," she said with a manufactured smile. She held out her hand. He took it and shook it. "Happy to be aboard, Commander." He released her hand and looked to Oridanis. "Admiral?" Oridanis smiled. "I wanted to hand this to you personally." He pulled out a small felt box. "For your exemplary service to Starfleet and the Federation, I am proud to promote you to captain." He opened it, and inside was the badge of rank in silver and gold. It was a tall, elongated diamond of brushed silver metal, with two sharp chevrons pointing downward at the top and bottom. Framed within the silver border were 3 horizontal rows of evenly spaced gold bars. Gorv stepped up and unpinned the commander insignia from the white stripe on the right shoulder of Asterios' uniform, and Oridanis pinned the new insignia in its place. Once Oridanis had finished, he held out his hand. Asterios took it and shook it. "Thank you, Admiral." He moved down the line, shaking Voss's hand next, and ended with Gorv. "Just because you're a captain now doesn't mean I'm not going to argue with you," Gorv stated. "Why do you think I brought you along to the Hemingway?" Asterios replied. "I figured Admiral Oridanis needed someone to keep you out of trouble, sir," he responded. Asterios nodded with a smirk. He turned back to Oridanis. "Is our first mission to take you back to the Klingon border, sir?" Oridanis shook his head. "No. The USS Agincourt will be arriving with your science officer, and they will take me back to my post. They should be here in the next few hours." Voss perked up at the mention of the other ship. "Isn't the Agincourt an Excelsior class?" "It is," he confirmed. "They completed a refit at Utopia Planitia, picked up your new science officer from Jupiter Station, and came straight here." Voss turned to look at Asterios. "New science officer?" "Yes, Lieutenant Nara Vel. She has been assigned to the Hemingway as the foremost expert on the Typhon sector. From what I understand, the Hemingway didn't have a dedicated science officer on the bridge or as part of the senior staff," Asterios answered with a question of his own. "That is correct. The previous lieutenant commander retired at the same time as the captain," she explained. "Your report stated that you've been rotating the senior officer slot between the 3 lieutenants in the department. While the new officer will hold the same rank, she will formally fill that role for the duration of this mission," he informed her. Voss raised an eyebrow, something Asterios noted. "Understood." Asterios looked back at Oridanis. "Until next time, Admiral." He shook his hand again. Oridanis walked over and took his place on the transporter pad. "Captain Ferdinand, good luck on your mission." Gorv engaged the transporter, sending the Admiral back to Epsilon Station. They watched as he dematerialized, then the 3 of them stepped out into the corridors of the Hemingway. The hallways were narrower and brighter overall than the ones on Epsilon Station, something Asterios would need to get used to, but he kept pace alongside Voss. "I have also sent over my updates to the duty roster and other minor assignments aboard," Asterios explained. "Once we have our new science officer, I would like to get underway as soon as possible." "Understood, sir," she responded. Asterios looked at Gorv. "Lieutenant Commander, I want you to do a full once-over on the Hemingway. Make sure she's ready for our mission. I expect we won't see a resupply station for quite some time," he ordered. They boarded a turbolift. Bridge, Asterios called out. It began moving. Gorv nodded. Understood, Captain. She might be newer than Epsilon Station, but that doesn't always mean better. If she has issues, I'll find them. The doors of the turbolift opened to the bridge. Asterios looked between the two of them. Get it done. They entered the bridge. Asterios looked around it for the first time in person, not through a view screen. The bridge of the USS Hemingway was a wide, circular command center that felt spacious and deliberately organized. It was less warm than the Armstrong, and more blue than the grey and off-white of the Epsilon CIC, with grey deck plates, white structural framing, and deep blue upholstery on every seat. Computers and displays wrapped around the walls. His eyes followed the circle, taking in the outer stations, tiered slightly higher than the command area, their large curved console banks angled inward so that every officer faced the center of the room. A low railing separated this outer ring from a sunken command well, where the captain's chair sat alone on a raised central dais. He looked at the chair for a few moments. It was a single high-backed blue chair with a small console at its arm, positioned so that its occupant had unobstructed sightlines to every station on the bridge. Forward of the chair, two sleek console wings curved outward for helm and navigation. "Captain on the bridge," one of the junior officers called out as he stepped from the turbolift. "At ease," Asterios responded. There was a moment of hesitation before the crew moved again. His voice was still new to them, compared to Voss's. Then they returned to their stations and their work. Asterios moved slowly towards the chair. He had tried for so long not to have to sit in one, and here he was, about to do exactly that. He thought back to the Armstrong, to the battle, to the speech, and he steeled himself. He descended into the command well while Gorv watched from the operations station. Asterios imagined how Demetrios would have looked in this chair, with the ease of command he always had. He stood in front of the chair for a few seconds longer. Then he turned and sat down. It was more comfortable than the Armstrong's captain's chair, firmer, with more padding. He shifted until he found a way of sitting that suited him. When he finally did, he picked up a datapad from the console beside the chair and pulled up some of the administrative work waiting for him. After about 2 hours of this, he decided he had spent enough time on the bridge and should probably meet the crew of the Hemingway. He looked at Voss. "Commander, you have the bridge." Voss nodded and moved to the captain's chair. He headed for the turbolift, figuring he would start in engineering. He was slightly surprised that Voss had not suggested an informal meet and greet in the main conference room behind the bridge. He was glad because he would have had to reject the idea. If the senior staff wanted to meet with him, they could schedule a meeting or have him come to them. "Deck 6, main engineering," he ordered. The doors closed and the lift started moving. There was always some friction when a new commanding officer took charge of a crew and a ship. He could feel it. Everyone was a little on edge. It had been similar when he took over Epsilon Station, though that posting was more administrative. He had a job to do, and it was unlikely anyone here would appreciate it for long, but he was all right with that. On the Armstrong, he had been the bad guy to Demetrios's personal approach with his crew. It was a role he was used to, even if he was a bit rusty. It had a different feel when you were the captain, and not the executive officer. He arrived on Deck 6 and made his way to main engineering. The doors opened and Asterios stepped in. The room was a low-ceilinged but surprisingly open rectangular compartment, matching the colour scheme of the rest of the ship with its grey panels, white structure, and dark blue accents. Dominating the centre of the room was the warp core housing, a compact cylindrical column rising from a glassed-off opening in the deck. At its centre glowed the blue matter-antimatter mix chamber, the warp core itself sitting farther back in the ship, and the energy it contained cast a soft pulse of light across the room. Behind the housing stood a display table, much like the one in his old CIC, though this one focused on the ship's operations, and behind that was a large, angled Master Systems display console. The whole room smelled faintly of ozone and coolant, and the warp core breathed its steady, rhythmic pulse. An engineering ensign stood at a control panel off to the side of the warp core. He saw the captain. "Captain on deck," he called out, snapping to attention. A few of the other junior officers snapped to attention as well. "At ease," he said, releasing them. He approached the ensign. "I'm looking for Lieutenant Dex." "She's down in the corridor, sir," he said, glancing toward the leftmost pair of ladders in the far corner of the room, each leading down to the lower level of main engineering, where the long connection to the warp core resided. "I could calm down and have her come up." Asterios shook his head. "That won't be necessary. I'll go to her." He made his way to the leftmost ladder and climbed down. The lower level was a long, narrow corridor with the glowing blue warp conduit running its length. About 20 feet ahead was Lieutenant Dex. He could tell by the close-cut, bright, natural red hair, the trill markings down the side of her head and neck, and the two other engineers hunched next to the conduit. They didn't notice him until he was a few feet away. Dex looked at him. "Captain on deck," she said firmly. The two engineers, not used to having their work interrupted, hesitated, looking at Asterios and then at each other, and came to attention a beat too late, slightly embarrassed. "At ease," he said, motioning for them to keep working. The two engineers returned to their task. Dex gave them a few quick instructions before making her way to Asterios. She maintained a professional demeanor and an accepting look in her eyes, offering a hand as her gaze flicked to the new rank insignia. "Welcome aboard, Captain. We met when the Hemingway docked, but we didn't get a chance for an actual introduction," she started. Asterios took her hand and shook it. "Thank you, Lieutenant. I'm making my rounds to meet our senior staff. I've read your file, and it's impressive." She smiled. "Thank you. It has to be to stay in the Trill Initiate program. It's a lot of stress, being the best at what you do while constantly being watched. But that's part of the life," she explained. Asterios admired the number of initiates who joined Starfleet, given the demands of both and the weight of always having two different sets of eyes watching. "How do you think the Hemingway will do on her first exploratory voyage?" She motioned to the warp conduit. "She's a good ship, but I don't know. We've mostly been doing our shakedown in the Federation's interior. I have confidence she'll do well on the frontier, even if she wasn't designed for it the way the old Constitution class was, or the new Excelsiors are. I think she'll surprise us. That's what we're out there to prove, that this new line of ships can do it all. Not to speak too soon, but I think she'll prove you right, and then some," Dex said. She looked down the conduit at the ship around her, something unguarded passing over her face, then looked back at Asterios. "I agree. Could you put together a short report on the meaningful differences between the Centaur class and the Miranda class?" "I want—" he started, but a nearby wall communicator beeped. "Captain Ferdinant, contact the bridge." He looked at Dex. "Excuse me for a moment." He moved to the communicator and pressed the button. "This is Captain Ferdinant." "Captain," Voss's voice came through. "The Agincourt has arrived and is requesting to send over Lieutenant Nara Vel." "Authorized. I'll meet her in Transporter Bay 2, Asterios responded. "Acknowledged, Captain." He released the comms button and returned to Dex. "Thank you for your time, Lieutenant. I'll send the rest of that request to your station this evening," Asterios said with a nod. He headed back to the ladder, climbed out of the lower level of main engineering, and then made his way to Transporter Bay 2. He walked into the room just as Lieutenant Nara Vel materialized. She was a tall, thin humanoid woman with angular features, a Thashari, one of the newer members of the Federation. Her species had evolved on a tidally locked world, which left them with pale grey skin and faint bioluminescent filaments, the only colour their bodies carried, their hair ranging from black to white. Hers traced outward from her sternum, along her collarbone and the inside of her wrists. Her off-white hair was pulled into a tight bun and tied with the only colour on her that wasn't Starfleet issue, a metallic gold ribbon. She smiled widely when she saw Asterios. "Captain Ferdinand," she said. She walked toward him and offered her hand with the casualness of a civilian, which was a little startling to Asterios, given that Nara wore the red Starfleet uniform. Starfleet wasn't a military organization, and its formality was significantly looser than that of older human military traditions, but it still maintained a level of professionalism. His briefing from Oridanis rang true. Her years as a civilian and her recent entry into Starfleet were showing, and it was something he would likely need to work on with her, and with the rest of the crew. "Lieutenant, I know you're new to Starfleet, but there are protocols and regulations for most of what we do, in particular for boarding a ship, greeting officers of higher rank, and interacting with your commanding officer. I would advise you to review them. The Academy and the ship that carried you here may take a more relaxed attitude, but I tend to run my ships a bit closer to the book," Asterios informed her. He did, however, take her hand and shake it. The quick dress down was not what she had expected from her first interaction with her captain. It did not help that she was almost 18 years his senior. "Is that necessary, Captain? I am a researcher and scientist first, a Starfleet officer second," she tried to explain. Asterios was having none of it. "Not on the Hemingway. Here you are an officer first, scientist second. Your knowledge and expertise are incredibly valuable and will greatly help the mission before us. But you need to understand that those rules and regulations exist for a reason. They exist, so I know that when I give you an order, even one you disagree with, you will follow it. We can argue about it later in private, but when there are lives on the line, I need to know you'll do your duty. Do you understand?" The sharpness had come out faster than he intended, and over something small. He knew exactly where it came from, and he did not care to examine it just then. He released her hand. Her face hadn't changed during the entire exchange, still set in that perpetual grin. "Of course, Captain. I will do better," she conceded. "Thank you. Welcome aboard the Hemingway," he said with a bit more warmth. He motioned for her to follow him, intending to escort her to her quarters. She followed. "There has been a change in your assignment since Admiral Oridanis appointed you to the Hemingway. Originally, you were to serve under the senior science officer, providing your expertise and research to them, as we explored the Typhon sector. However, they retired shortly after the captain of the Hemingway did, which is why I am placing you in that role instead, as senior science officer and bridge officer. Rather than having your expertise filtered through another officer, you will provide it directly to the rest of the senior staff, and me." This was the first thing to break her smile. It faltered for only a few seconds. "I am used to working on my own and reporting my findings to superiors, not being in charge of an entire department. I'm not a leader," she explained. He had prepared for that. Asterios nodded. "The alternatives are that we wait for another transfer to the Hemingway, or we promote one of the junior officers already aboard. The options are slim. The Hemingway wasn't much of a science vessel before this mission, and the two candidates have been in the service about as long as you have, but are both much younger." He paused as they waited for the turbolift. "I would like to get underway as soon as possible, and of the choices in front of me, I have confidence in your ability to grow into the role as the mission unfolds." The doors opened. She stepped in first, and he followed, ordering the turbolift to the deck where her quarters were located. She thought about it for a minute, clearly mulling it over. He was not above simply ordering her to take the post, but he wanted to keep that as a backup. He had learned early on that with civilians, it was better to ask and have them agree than to give an order. And while she was technically an officer, she didn't see herself as one yet. "I will do my best, Captain," she finally answered. They arrived at Deck 3, and she stepped out ahead of Asterios again. "That's all I'm asking. You'll do well, Lieutenant," Asterios assured her. "Not to put you to work immediately, but I have already sent over my planned route through the Typhon sector. If you could look it over and give me a report before we get underway tomorrow, I would appreciate it." She looked at Asterios. "I'll get right on that and have it to you by 0600, she said, with a bit more interest than she had shown for the rest of the conversation. They arrived outside her quarters. "These are your quarters. They're a bit bigger since you're a bridge officer, though they won't compare to Jupiter Station," he explained. She pressed the button to open the door. Life on a starship, leadership, and being a senior officer. "Many things to get used to," she said. "I will see you on the bridge, Captain." Asterios nodded, then turned and left Nara to her quarters. He stopped at a nearby terminal to check the time, and while he was there, he found Lieutenant Chereth, head of security and the bridge's tactical officer, in the armory on Deck 7. Asterios made his way there next. The armory was tucked into the back of the saucer section, which Asterios found odd. On the Armstrong, it had at least been on the same deck as the transporters, but here it seemed to have been added as an afterthought to the ship's design. He walked into the small rectangular room, 2 desks and terminals in the front half, the back half lined with Type 3 phaser rifles racked on the left and right walls. A set of lockers stood like pillars through the middle of the back half, holding racks of Type 2 phaser pistols. Lieutenant Chereth was at one of the desks with the communications officer, Lieutenant Junior Grade Oisin Calloway. Chereth was an Andorian in his early 40s with pale blue skin and 2 antennae rising from shaggy dark grey hair. He had hard eyes the colour of steel and a thin, wiry frame that belied his strength. Calloway was a human from Ireland in his late 20s, a broad-shouldered man with short auburn hair, a neatly trimmed beard to match, and sharp green eyes. Both stood at attention as Asterios entered the room. "At ease, gentlemen," Asterios stated. "I'm making my way around to speak with the bridge crew. I'm glad I caught you both." He shook their hands. Calloway started first. "I wanted to touch up my skills with a phaser, sir. I haven't really handled one since the academy." Asterios liked the initiative. Hostilities could break out during their explorations, and their proximity to the Romulans didn't make ground engagements impossible. He doubted it would be as bad as fighting Klingons, but the unknown had a habit of casting shadows on the wall when the real threat was much smaller. "That's smart," he said, looking at Chereth. "Perhaps a shipwide refresher course would be wise to get everyone back up to speed. What do you think, Lieutenant Chereth?" Chereth nodded. "I think that's a great plan, Captain. The Hemingway and her crew are too used to the safety of Federation space. Some practice will do them good." Asterios liked those answers. "Get it done. I'm authorizing an hour at the end of each shift for phaser training with the security team, along with any other security training you think is necessary, Lieutenant," Asterios said with an undertone of enthusiasm. "I'll put together a schedule and get it to you by tomorrow," Chereth continued. "Fantastic. Make sure to include all senior staff, myself included. I don't get to skip practice just because I'm the captain," Asterios said with confidence. Chereth smirked slightly before returning to his natural neutral expression. "Understood, sir." Calloway nodded along with the discussion, clearly proud that his initiative had grown into a policy that would, in his eyes, improve the ship's readiness. Then he seemed to weigh something and decided now was as good a time as any. "Captain, request to speak freely?" Calloway asked. "Granted, Lieutenant," Asterios answered. He liked hearing the real opinions of his crew and officers, so long as it was done in settings like this. "What are your thoughts on the Klingon liaison, Colonel Katal, being on board?" He asked it the way only a fairly young officer could, someone who hadn't lived through the height of the conflict between the Klingons and the Federation. Chereth looked at him with a coldness that Asterios noticed. Chereth was older than even Asterios and had fought in the brief war of 2285 and the long, cold hostility that followed until 2293. Their eyes met, and there was an unspoken exchange. Chereth deferred to Asterios to answer the question. He looked back at Calloway. "I think it's good to have someone with such expertise on the Romulans aboard, and it speaks to the Klingon Empire's desire to make the Khitomer Accords work and to strengthen our diplomatic ties." Asterios did his best not to make the response sound canned or disingenuous, because while he would have liked to believe what he was saying, he didn't. He had his reservations about letting a Klingon, let alone a professor of tactics and warfare, aboard a newly designed starship filled with the most recent technology the Federation had to offer, and having him provide tactical information about their shared enemy, the Romulans, seemed dubious at best. But he let none of that show. Calloway listened to the answer. Asterios wasn't sure if he believed it, but if he didn't reveal it. "I read his file in the original Klingon, since translations of formal Klingon writing are still a bit dubious. His paper on Jonathan Archer's leadership and tactics during the Earth and Romulan War is quite unique and not far from one of my tactics professors at the Academy published. However, his opinion that the fledgling Federation powers were too humane in their defeat of the Romulans, that we should have pushed all the way to Romulus and accepted nothing short of total surrender, like Truman and the Japanese in the Second World War, seems to say he thinks we should have been more like the Klingons. Asterios glanced at Chereth, who showed nothing, though Asterios suspected he was impressed as well. Calloway seemed to realize he had rambled and looked embarrassed. "I apologize, Captain and Lieutenant. I didn't mean to—" Asterios put his hand up. "It's quite all right, Lieutenant. Your initiative in understanding our guest is appreciated. There is nothing wrong with being thorough. We've come a long way as a species since Truman, in no small part because of our allies. I fear what that alliance might look like if we had acted more like Klingons," Asterios assured him, and that much he did believe. Chereth added nothing, seeming content to enjoy the exchange. Calloway smiled. "Well, Captain, I have a few reports to finish before the end of my shift. Thank you for letting me speak my mind. I'll see you on the bridge." Asterios nodded and gave a professional smile. "I'll see you on the bridge, Lieutenant." Calloway left the armory. Chereth looked at Asterios. "That was a good response to our young officer. I almost believed you, Captain." Asterios sighed slightly. "We do our best to embody our ideals. Right, Lieutenant?" He caught another quick smirk from Chereth. "Of course, Captain. It is unbecoming of an officer to hold grudges. That being said, do I have your authority to monitor any communications our liaison officer might be sending out?" Chereth asked. "Yes, he has full access to the ship, but make sure he doesn't linger anywhere he isn't supposed to be for too long. The Hemingway might not be as advanced as an Excelsior, but she's still got more tools and tricks than the mainline ships had during the war. Let's not let our new friends take too long a look under the hood of our newest ship." "Understood, sir." He paused. He changed the subject. "We do have a monthly gathering in one of the gaming rooms for veterans of the war. It's less of a support group and more of a billiards club." Asterios looked at him with genuine curiosity, trying to read his face for any hint of why he had extended the invitation. It was clear Chereth had looked him up, but that didn't seem to be where this was coming from. The reason stayed elusive. "I'll see if I have availability," he answered, unsure whether he would actually go. "Understood, sir. Is there anything else I can help you with?" Asterios shook his head. "Nothing else, Lieutenant. Carry on." He turned and left the armory. He checked the time on a display. It was close to the end of the shift. He could spend the rest of it in his ready room, going over whatever administrative work remained for the day. He made his way there. The ready room was significantly smaller than his office on Epsilon, though he didn't actually care about the size. The real downgrade was the lack of a food synthesizer. It was an L-shaped room with a small bathroom attached and a closet. In front of the closet sat the box of items from Epsilon, the bottle of Romulan ale resting on top, the tag still attached. He decided to unpack later. He ordered a cup of espresso and a slice of pecan pie from the kitchen via the communicator, then settled behind his desk and began reviewing the reports sent to him during his rounds. After about 15 minutes, the ready room door chimed. "Come in," Asterios said firmly. The door opened to reveal Commander Voss, whom he was not expecting. "Commander." He stood. "How can I help you?" He motioned to the chair across from his desk. She moved over and sat down, and he sat as well. "I wanted to speak to you about the changes to the duty roster." Asterios had known this conversation was coming. He had swapped a few officers to create a bridge staff better suited to his command style, but he had also adjusted nearly every department on the ship. He had noticed discipline issues that seemed to have stemmed from the particular approach Voss and the prior captain had taken. His reassignments were not arbitrary. He had picked carefully through the rosters of each department while the paperwork for his promotion was being processed, imposing structure where there had been none. Previously, every junior officer and non-commissioned officer in a department reported directly to the section head. Asterios had created intermediate reports that would be submitted to their section leads, reducing the administrative load on the section heads. "What about it?" he asked. "I'm concerned that changing how we handle reporting and hierarchy right before a new mission may cause more confusion than it resolves. The senior officers are used to their current workload, and a sudden change could disrupt their performance. I expect a dip in productivity while they learn the new organization, but if we don't do it now, I don't know when we would during our mission. We'll be taking it slow in our first few months in the Typhon sector. I think that gives the crew enough time to adapt. Voss thought on this for a short time. He could see her reaching, likely with that partial betazoid empathy of hers, trying to find the source of this. Whatever she was looking for, she didn't seem to find it. I am not convinced that changing things for the sake of changing things is going to be productive for the Hemingway and her crew. Asterios' face hardened. Commander, I have heard your recommendation. The changes to the duty rosters and the organizational layout will proceed as I have outlined. I appreciate your feedback. Is there anything else? Voss's face went neutral. No, sir, nothing else. We should be ready to get underway tomorrow, she reported professionally. Asterios hadn't expected to need a more serious conversation with Voss. Not yet. He was glad she had brought her objection to him in private and while on duty. He still hoped she would adapt to his command style without a verbal correction. The door chimed. Understood. Have a good night, Commander, he said, dismissing her. She stood and opened the door for the ensign assigned to deliver his end-of-shift snack and espresso. She glanced over the tray, a slice of pie and a small cup of something dark she didn't recognize. An oddly personal order for a man who had given away nothing all day. Instead of overstaying her welcome, she greeted the ensign by name and left. She decided to do a little investigating and headed for the mess hall. Asterios thanked the ensign. He looked down at the pie and the small blue espresso cup. He wondered how Demetrios would have handled Voss, then took a sip of the drink. It wasn't as good as Xanor's, but it would suffice. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you'd like to hear more of Star Trek: Farewell to Arms on the Outer Almanac.